Every day, millions of people wake up and reach for a cup of coffee. Yet few realize that within that steaming mug lies a story centuries in the making. Of goats in Ethiopian highlands, Sufi monks in Yemen, secretive traders, empires at war, enslaved laborers, colonial ambitions, climate crises, and global markets that dictate who thrives and who struggles. Coffee is not just a drink, it's a mirror of human ambition, power, and inequality. And with every sip, we are part of its story. Coffee's story is often introduced as a charming legend, almost harmless in its simplicity. Somewhere in the Ethiopian highlands around the 9th century, a goat herder named Kaldi notices his animals behaving strangely, leaping, restless, energized after chewing bright red berries from a shrub. Curious, he brings the berries to local monks. They experiment, boiling or chewing them, and discover that the fruit keeps them awake through long nights of prayer. Whether this moment ever happened is impossible to confirm. There is no contemporary record of Kaldi, no manuscript documenting this discovery. Yet the legend persists because it does something powerful. It frames coffee as a gift of alertness, a tool for endurance, and a bridge between the natural world and human ritual. But legends often survive not because they are true, but because they are useful. This one anchors coffee to spirituality, discipline, and purpose, softening a history that would later be marked by monopolies, bans, forced labor, and global inequality. The reality is that coffee's rise was neither innocent nor accidental. It followed paths carved by power, fear, commerce, and control. To understand coffee is not simply to trace a beverage's popularity, but to follow how a stimulant reshaped social life and how societies responded when alert minds began gathering together. The coffee plant itself, Coffea arabica, is native to the forests of Ethiopia. For centuries, local communities consumed it in various forms, chewed, mixed with fats, or used medicinally. But it was across the Red Sea in Yemen that coffee became something new, a drink deliberately brewed for its psychoactive effects. By the 15th century, Sufi mystics in Yemen were drinking coffee to remain awake during extended nights of devotion and chanting. This use was not recreational. It was disciplined, ritualized, and spiritual. Coffee fit neatly into a culture that valued endurance, focus, and transcendence through repetition and prayer. Yemen's geography played a decisive role in what followed. Its highlands were well suited to cultivation, and its ports, especially Mocha, connected inland producers to maritime trade routes spanning the Indian Ocean. As coffee's popularity spread within the Islamic world, Yemen emerged as the central hub of production and export. This position was not left to chance. Yemeni traders moved quickly to protect their advantage, roasting beans before export to ensure they could not be planted elsewhere. Coffee was not just an agricultural product. It was a controlled substance guarded through knowledge, technique, and policy. As coffee spread through the Middle East, it entered societies already accustomed to regulating substances that altered consciousness. Alcohol was forbidden in Islamic law, but coffee occupied a gray area. It sharpened the mind rather than dulling it, yet it clearly altered mood, energy, and behavior. Coffee houses began to appear in cities like Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and later Istanbul. These spaces were unprecedented. They were not mosques, where behavior was formal and sacred. They were not markets, driven purely by transaction. They were not homes, limited by kinship. Coffee houses were public, semi-private, and socially fluid. People gathered to drink, talk, listen to music, play games, share news, and debate ideas. Information moved faster within their walls than through official channels. For authorities, this was deeply unsettling. Rulers and religious leaders feared not coffee itself, but what coffee enabled. Long conversations, sharp attention, collective listening, and the formation of opinion outside institutional oversight. In Mecca, officials attempted to ban coffee entirely, declaring it intoxicating and socially dangerous. Public burnings of coffee beans were staged as warnings. Yet bans proved fragile. They were inconsistently enforced, widely ignored, and often reversed. The reason was simple. Coffee houses were already embedded in urban life. Merchants used them to exchange information about prices and routes. Scholars debated theology and philosophy. Poets performed. Travelers shared news from distant regions. To suppress coffeehouses entirely was to suppress the circulation of knowledge and commerce itself. Authorities oscillated between repression and accommodation. In some periods, coffeehouses were shut down violently. In others, they were tolerated or even quietly monitored, becoming unofficial sites of surveillance where rulers could observe public sentiment rather than eliminate it. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul's coffeehouses flourished as the empire expanded, connecting diverse populations through shared routines of consumption and conversation. These venues eroded rigid social hierarchies. A bureaucrat might sit near a merchant, a craftsman beside a poet. Status mattered less when everyone drank from the same cups. This leveling effect alarmed elites. Some Ottoman sultans ordered coffeehouses closed, at times enforcing bans with extreme punishments. Yet enforcement rarely lasted. The economic importance of coffee and the popularity of the spaces made total prohibition impractical. Coffee, in this context, functioned as a political technology. It did not carry ideology on its own, but it created conditions where ideas could circulate more freely. Alertness extended evenings. Repetition built communities. Conversation produced networks. Every empire that encountered coffee eventually confronted the same question. How much uncontrolled gathering could it tolerate? When coffee entered Europe, it carried these anxieties with it. Venetian traders first introduced coffee through Mediterranean trade networks, framing it as an exotic curiosity from the Islamic world. Early European responses mixed fascination with suspicion. Coffee was variously described as a medicine, a stimulant, a Muslim drink, and a potential moral threat. Some religious figures warned that it might corrupt Christian society. Others feared its health effects, claiming it overheated the blood or weakened the body. Yet curiosity prevailed. A pivotal moment came when church authorities, including the Pope according to popular accounts, declared coffee acceptable. Whether the story is embellished matters less than its effect. Coffee was symbolically neutralized. It was no longer a foreign threat, but a substance that could be assimilated into European life. Florida's endorsement opened the gates for rapid adoption. European coffeehouses soon appeared in cities like Venice, London, Paris, and Vienna. While inspired by Middle Eastern models, they developed distinct cultural roles. In London, coffeehouses became known as eight-penny universities, where for the price of a cup, one could access news, debate, and intellectual exchange. Merchants discussed shipping and insurance. Writers tested ideas. Politicians gauged public opinion. Some institutions that would later dominate global finance and media, including insurance markets and newspapers, traced their roots to these informal gatherings. These spaces reshaped European social life. Unlike taverns, which revolved around alcohol and intoxication, coffeehouses promoted sobriety, alertness, and extended productivity. They aligned neatly with emerging capitalist values: punctuality, calculation, discipline, and focus. Coffee extended the working day. It sharpened negotiation. It made long meetings tolerable. Over time, coffee became associated not with leisure but with work itself. Yet the same fears resurfaced. English authorities worried that coffeehouses facilitated sedition. Pamphlets and rumors spread rapidly within them. In the late 17th century, the English crown attempted to suppress coffeehouses, citing concerns over public disorder and political agitation. The effort failed almost immediately. Economic interests, public demand, and the sheer number of establishments made enforcement impossible. Once again, coffee proved too embedded to erase. As European demand grew, so did anxiety over dependence on foreign suppliers. Yemen's monopoly was strategically uncomfortable. European powers began seeking ways to cultivate coffee themselves. This was not a peaceful, agricultural exchange. It involved espionage, smuggling, and colonial expansion. The Dutch succeeded in acquiring live coffee plants and cultivating them in Java. The French followed, introducing coffee to Caribbean colonies. These acts shattered Yemen's dominance and reoriented coffee production toward colonial plantation systems. On plantations, coffee's character changed. What had once been a ritual drink associated with devotion and discussion became a mass commodity produced through coercion. Enslaved Africans and exploited laborers cleared land, planted trees, harvested cherries, and processed beans under brutal conditions. The global supply of coffee expanded dramatically, but its human cost deepened. European consumers, increasingly distant from production sites, encountered coffee as a refined beverage, detached from the violence that sustained it. By the time coffee became a daily habit in Europe, its origins had already been obscured. Place names like Mocha and Java transformed into brands rather than geographic realities. The drink story was rewritten as one of comfort, civility, and productivity, while the systems that supported it remained invisible. Coffee had completed its first great transformation, from sacred stimulant to social disruptor, from controlled trade good to colonial commodity. This transformation set the stage for everything that followed. Food. As production scaled and markets expanded, coffee would become entangled with industrialization, financial speculation, labor struggles, and global inequality. The forces that first tried to ban it for fear of unrest would later harness it to discipline, labor, and structure time. Coffee did not simply adapt to modernity, it helped create it. And as the world grew more dependent on this daily stimulant, the question of who controlled coffee and who paid the price for its availability frequently become more urgent. As coffee embedded itself into European daily life, its transformation accelerated alongside the rise of industrial capitalism. What had once been a drink tied to religious devotion and intellectual exchange increasingly became a tool for structuring time, disciplining bodies, and sustaining labor. The stimulant properties that once worried religious authorities were now celebrated by employers and governments. Coffee kept workers alert, extended shifts, and sharpened attention in environments that demanded repetition and endurance. The same alertness that once fueled debate in coffee houses now fueled factories, offices, and bureaucracies. Industrialization reshaped coffee not only as a social habit, but as a commodity engineered for scale. Roasting moved from small batches to industrial facilities. Grinding became mechanized. Packaging innovations allowed coffee to be stored longer and transported farther without spoiling. Consistency replaced variation. Flavor profiles were standardized to meet consumer expectations, reducing dependence on specific origins or harvest conditions. In this process, value migrated further away from the places where coffee was grown. Growers produced raw material. Profits accumulated where coffee was transformed, branded, and sold. This shift intensified during the 19th century as global trade networks expanded and colonial powers competed for dominance. Coffee became a strategic crop, central to the economies of colonies across Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Brazil, in particular, emerged as a dominant force. With vast land, favorable climate, and a labor system built on slavery and later exploitative wage labor, Brazil scaled coffee production to unprecedented levels. By the late 19th century, it supplied a significant share of the world's coffee, shaping prices and supply patterns far beyond its borders. The human cost of this expansion. Enslaved people worked under brutal conditions, and even after formal abolition, systems of debt bondage, coercion, and repression persisted. Plantation life revolved around extraction. Forests were cleared. Soils were exhausted. Labor was treated as expendable. Coffee fueled economic growth in consuming nations while entrenching inequality and instability in producing regions. This imbalance became structural, embedded into contracts, trade practices, and financial systems that prioritized volume and price over welfare. As production increased, markets grew more complex. Coffee was no longer just traded as a physical good. It became a financial instrument. Futures markets emerged, allowing buyers and sellers to hedge against price fluctuations. In theory, these tools provided stability. In practice, they introduced speculation. Traders far removed from farms could profit from volatility. Producers bore the risks of unpredictable prices, weather, and yield. A bad harvest could devastate a farming community, while a price swing could enrich investors who never touched a coffee plant. The early 20th century intensified these dynamics. Brazil, facing chronic oversupply, attempted to stabilize prices through cartel-like strategies. Coffee was stockpiled, withheld from markets, and in extreme cases destroyed to prevent price collapse. Millions of bags were burned or dumped, even as poverty persisted among workers who produced them. This deliberate destruction revealed a fundamental contradiction. Coffee was abundant enough to waste, yet the people who grew it remained precarious. Control over supply did not translate into shared prosperity. Meanwhile, consumption patterns continued to evolve. In the United States, coffee became deeply intertwined with national identity and labor culture. Tea, once dominant, declined after political boycotts and shifting tastes. Coffee filled the gap, marketed as energizing, democratic, and modern. It accompanied westward expansion, military campaigns, and industrial growth. Soldiers drank it in camps and trenches. Factory workers relied on it to endure long hours. Coffee breaks were institutionalized, reinforcing its role as a sanctioned stimulant within disciplined routines. Advertising played a central role in shaping these perceptions. Coffee companies crafted narratives linking coffee to domestic harmony, productivity, and emotional comfort. Brands promised consistency and reliability, masking the volatility of global supply chains behind familiar logos and slogans. Packaging innovations allowed coffee to reach households far from urban centers, embedding it into everyday life. As coffee became normalized, questions about its origins and impacts faded from public consciousness. Yet concerns never disappeared entirely. Health debates resurfaced periodically, with critics warning of nervous disorders, digestive issues, or moral decline. These anxieties mirrored broader societal tensions around stimulants, speed, and industrial life. Coffee was both praised and feared as a symbol of modern acceleration. Governments monitored consumption, but rarely intervened decisively. The economic importance of coffee made outright restriction impractical. As the 20th century progressed, industrialization further transformed coffee through technological innovation. Instant coffee emerged as a solution to demands for convenience, shelf stability, and mass distribution. Initially developed for military and emergency use, it soon entered civilian markets. While often criticized for inferior taste, instant coffee expanded access and reinforced coffee's role as a functional necessity rather than a sensory experience. The emphasis shifted from flavor to efficiency. At the same time, espresso machines reshaped coffee culture in parts of Europe. In Italy, espresso bars became symbols of urban rhythm, quick, intense, and communal. This form of consumption reinforced coffee's adaptability. It could be slow and contemplative, or fast and transactional. It could anchor long conversations or punctuate brief encounters. Its flexibility allowed it to integrate into diverse cultural contexts while maintaining its stimulant core. Behind these cultural shifts, power continued to concentrate. A small number of multinational corporations came to dominate coffee trading, roasting, and branding. Their scale allowed them to source from multiple origins, blend beans to maintain consistency, and negotiate prices aggressively. For producers, this meant diminished bargaining power. Buyers could switch suppliers with minimal disruption, while farmers remained tied to land, climate, and long-term investments. This asymmetry was reinforced by the structure of global markets. Coffee prices were determined largely by exchanges and contracts, disconnected from production costs. When prices fell, farmers absorbed losses. Stavos bifros, gains were often captured by intermediaries. Efforts to organize producers into cooperatives offered some protection, but these structures faced their own challenges, including access to capital, governance issues, and vulnerability to market swings. By the late 20th century, awareness of these inequalities began to grow among consumers. Reports of poverty, labor abuses, and environmental degradation in coffee-producing regions challenged the benign image cultivated by brands. In response, certifications and ethical sourcing initiatives emerged. Labels promised fair prices, sustainable practices, and improved livelihoods. For some farmers, these programs offered tangible benefits, higher prices, training, and market access. However, these initiatives also introduced new complexity. Certification required compliance with standards that entailed costs, documentation audits, changes in practice that many smallholders struggled to meet. Benefits were unevenly distributed. Some producers were excluded entirely. Others found that premiums did not offset expenses. Meanwhile, corporations used ethical branding to protect reputations without fundamentally altering profit distribution. Sustainability became a marketing asset as much as a moral commitment. As technology advanced, new tools promised greater transparency. Digital tracking, blockchain systems, and data platforms claimed to trace coffee from farm to cup. In theory, these innovations could empower producers by making their work visible. In practice, control over data often rested with buyers and platforms. Information became another resource extracted from producers, reinforcing dependence rather than autonomy. Regulatory pressures in consumer markets added further layers. Laws aimed at reducing deforestation, forced labor, and environmental harm required detailed reporting and compliance. While well-intentioned, these regulations often favored large producers and exporters with resources to navigate bureaucracy. Smallholders faced exclusion or increased costs. The burden of compliance shifted downward even as benefits accrued up. Meanwhile, social media and the rise of specialty coffee reframed coffee as a lifestyle choice and identity marker. Cafes emphasized origin stories, tasting notes, and artisanal craftsmanship. Consumers were invited to appreciate nuance and difference. This movement challenged industrial uniformity and reintroduced attention to place and process. For some producers, specialty markets offered higher prices and recognition. Yet specialty coffee represented only a small fraction of global production. The majority of coffee remained a commoditized blend sold through mass market channels. Even within specialty markets, risks persisted. Higher quality demands required greater labor and investment. Rejected lots could mean financial loss. Producers gambled on quality premiums without guarantees. The system celebrated excellence while externalizing risk. Climate change added a new layer of uncertainty. Coffee, particularly Arabica, is sensitive to temperature, rainfall, and pests. Rising temperatures pushed suitable growing zones uphill. Erratic weather disrupted flowering and yields. Diseases spread into new areas. Farmers faced mounting costs for adaptation, irrigation, shade management, new varieties. Often without adequate support, those least equipped to adapt faced the greatest threat. Industry responses framed resilience as a shared goal, but solutions often placed responsibility on producers. Training programs and pilot projects offered incremental improvements, yet structural issues remained. Carbon offsets and sustainability pledges addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental imbalance, low and volatile prices, persisted. Labor conditions continued to draw scrutiny. Seasonal workers often lacked protections, fair wages, and safe conditions. In some regions, child labor remained a reality, driven by poverty and lack of alternative. Audits and codes of conduct struggled to capture complex realities. Brands claimed clean supply chains while abuses persisted in hidden layers. As coffee demand diversified into pods, ready-to-drink beverages, and functional blends, margins increased for processors and marketers. Product innovation distanced consumers further from production realities, as nutritional claims and convenience features overshadowed questions of equity. Coffee became ever more present, yet ever more abstract. By this point, coffee was no longer just a drink. It was a system, a dense web of agriculture, finance, culture, and power. Each cup embodied centuries of decisions about who controls resources, who bears risk, and whose labor remains invisible. The forces that once tried to ban coffee for fear of unrest had learned instead to harness it, shaping economies and habits on a global scale. And still, the story was not finished. New pressures, environmental, social, and economic, were converging, forcing a reckoning that the industry could no longer indefinitely postpone. As the pressures on the coffee system intensified, the contradictions at its core became increasingly difficult to ignore. On one hand, global consumption continued to rise, driven by population growth, urbanization, and the normalization of coffee as an everyday necessity. On the other, the foundations of production, land, labor, climate stability, and economic viability were eroding. This imbalance exposed a system optimized for short-term availability rather than long-term sustainability. Climate change emerged as the most destabilizing force. Coffee, particularly Arabica, thrives within narrow environmental parameters. Even small shifts in temperature or rainfall can disrupt flowering cycles, reduce yields, and degrade quality. As global temperatures rose, traditional growing regions experienced increased heat stress, prolonged droughts, or intense rainfall, events that triggered erosion and disease. Pests such as coffee leaf rust expanded into higher altitudes, overwhelming farms unprepared for their spread. So, for farmers, adaptation required investment. Shade trees had to be planted and managed, irrigation systems installed or expanded, new, more resilient varieties tested despite uncertain market acceptance. Each adaptation demanded time, labor, and capital. Larger estates and well-financed producers could experiment and absorb losses. Smallholders, who produced the majority of the world's coffee, often could not. For them, climate change was not an abstract future risk but a daily calculation of survival. As yields declined or became more unpredictable, income instability worsened. Coffee trees take years to mature, locking farmers into long-term commitments. When prices fell or crops failed, exit was not simple. Debt accumulated. Families cut costs by reducing hired labor or relying on unpaid family work. In some regions, children were pulled into the fields to compensate for labor shortages, perpetuating cycles of poverty and limited education. Migration became an increasingly common response. Younger generations, observing the volatility and physical demands of coffee farming, chose to leave rural areas for cities or other countries. This exodus drained communities of labor and knowledge. Aging farmers struggled to maintain farms without successors. Abandoned fields became more vulnerable to disease and degradation, further reducing production and resilience. The loss of generational continuity threatened not only livelihoods, but cultural traditions tied to land and cultivation. Despite these warning signs, global markets often responded in counterintuitive ways. Forecasts of future shortages driven by climate impacts were used by corporations to justify price increases at the retail level. Yet these higher prices rarely translated into higher payments for farmers. Scarcity narratives became marketing tools rather than mechanisms for redistribution. Investment flowed into branding, technology, and alternative origins rather than into stabilizing incomes at the farm gate. This dynamic reflected a broader pattern of risk displacement. Financial volatility, climate uncertainty, and compliance costs were pushed downward onto producers, while profits and flexibility accumulated upward. Multinational buyers maintained the ability to switch origins, adjust blends, and hedge prices. Farmers remained exposed to forces they could neither predict nor control. Even cooperative structures struggled to negotiate fair terms in markets dominated by a handful of powerful buyers. Consolidation intensified these pressures. Over time, mergers and acquisitions reduced the number of major traders, roasters, and retailers. This concentration of power enabled coordinated sourcing strategies and pricing leverage. When one buyer exited a region, others often followed, leaving producers with few alternatives. Competition among farmers intensified, driving prices down further. The promise of market efficiency masked a reality of unequal power relations. Transparency initiatives, while well-intentioned, often reinforced this imbalance. Data collection expanded through digital platforms tracking yields, quality, labor practices, and environmental metrics. Farmers were required to share information to maintain market access. In return, they received limited insight into pricing, contracts, or buyer strategies. Compliance demands multiplied. Certifications, regulatory requirements, and corporate standards overlapped and evolved. For farmers, navigating this landscape required administrative capacity and literacy that many lacked. Failure to comply risked exclusion from markets. Success did not guarantee stability. Premiums fluctuated. Standards changed. The burden of constant adaptation fell on those least equipped to bear it. Meanwhile, consumer-facing narratives continued to emphasize choice, quality, and experience. Specialty cafes offered curated tastings and origin stories. Packaging highlighted flavor notes and artisanal methods. While these narratives acknowledged farmers more explicitly than mass-market branding, they often romanticized hardship and resilience. Stories of struggle were framed as authenticity rather than injustice. Consumers were invited to appreciate complexity without confronting responsibility. Even within specialty markets, structural issues persisted. Quality standards were unforgiving. A single defect could disqualify a lot from premium pricing. Weather, pests, or processing errors beyond a farmer's control could erase months of work. The risk-reward balance remained skewed. While exceptional coffees could command high prices, the probability of achieving them consistently was low. Many farmers invested heavily only to face rejection and financial loss. Labor remained a persistent fault line. Coffee production is labor-intensive, particularly during harvest. Seasonal workers often migrate long distances, living in temporary housing with limited protections. Wages are frequently low, paid by volume rather than time, incentivizing speed over safety. Women and migrant workers face heightened vulnerability to exploitation. Oversight is difficult in remote regions with layered subcontracting. Audits and inspections struggle to capture these realities. Advance notice allows abuses to be hidden. Informal labor arrangements escape documentation. Brands rely on assurances from intermediaries, maintaining plausible deniability. When scandals surface, they are framed as exceptions rather than symptoms. The structural drivers, low prices, intense competition, and cost pressure, remain unaddressed. Environmental degradation compounds these social issues. Monoculture plantations reduce biodiversity and resilience. Chemical inputs contaminate soil and water. Deforestation accelerates climate impacts, creating feedback loops that further threaten production. Sustainable practices exist, but adoption requires investment and incentives that markets rarely provide. Environmental costs are externalized, borne by communities, rather. At the same time, innovation continued to reshape consumption. Single-serve pods, ready-to-drink beverages, and functional coffees expanded rapidly. These products increased convenience and margins, but generated waste and further distanced consumers from origin realities. Sustainability claims focused on packaging and carbon offsets rather than labor or income. The material footprint of coffee consumption grew even as awareness increased. Culturally, coffee retained its role as a social lubricant and productivity aid. Offices revolved around coffee machines. Cafes functioned as informal workplaces. Coffee breaks structured time. During crises, from economic downturns to pandemics, coffee consumption persisted as a small, reliable comfort. This emotional attachment insulated the industry from deeper scrutiny. Coffee felt essential, personal, and benign. Yet beneath this familiarity, tensions accumulated. Analysts warned of declining suitability for Arabia in many regions within decades. Some projected significant supply shortages. Others predicted a shift toward Robusta or new hybrid varieties. Each scenario carried implications for flavor, livelihoods, and land use. Adaptation at scale required coordination and investment that fragmented markets struggled to deliver. Producers faced difficult choices. Some diversified into other crops. Others abandoned farming entirely. A few consolidated land and mechanized, reducing labor needs but increasing capital intensity. These strategies reshaped rural landscapes, often favoring larger players. Smallholders were squeezed from both sides by environmental stress and market power. Efforts at reform gained visibility. Advocates called for living income benchmarks, long-term contracts, and profit-sharing models. Experiments in direct trade and localized processing aimed to capture more value near production. Some initiatives showed promise, but scaling them proved challenging. Entrenched interests resisted changes that threatened margins or control. Arguments about efficiency and traceability masked deeper fears of losing power. Governments in producing countries faced constraints. Dependence on export revenue limited their leverage. Investment in rural infrastructure competed with other priorities. Trade agreements favored market access over labor protections. Policy tools existed but were unevenly applied. In many cases, states deferred to market forces, perpetuating vulnerability. As these dynamics converged, the coffee system approached a critical juncture. Climate instability, labor shortages, and social pressure threatened its continuity. Yet the system's complexity and inertia made transformation difficult. Coffee had become too embedded in daily life, too intertwined with global trade, to change easily. The question was no longer whether the system was flawed. That was evident. The question was whether the forces that benefited from its current structure would allow meaningful change, or whether adaptation would simply reproduce inequality in new forms. The answer would shape not only the future of coffee, but the livelihoods of millions who depend on it. The modern coffee industry stands as a testament to both human ingenuity and human inequity. From its legendary origins in Ethiopia to its present status as a global commodity, coffee reflects centuries of experimentation, trade, adaptation, and exploitation. Every cup carries layers of history, Neolithic commerce, colonialism, industrialization, finance, and climate impact. The seemingly simple act of brewing a cup is embedded in complex networks of power and labor, much of it invisible to consumers. At the farm level, the pressures are immediate and tangible. Climate variability continues to erode predictability. Coffee diseases, once confined to limited regions, now threaten vast swaths of Arabica cultivation. Farmers must invest in pest control, shade management, irrigation, and experimentation with hybrid or resistant varieties. These investments are costly, often requiring loans or informal credit systems, which themselves carry risk. Crop failures or disease outbreaks can trigger cascading effects, debt, migration, or abandonment of farms. The cycle of vulnerability is entrenched, perpetuating inequality across generations. Labor conditions remain precarious. Seasonal and migrant workers constitute the backbone of the harvest, yet often lack legal protection, fair wages, and safety measures. Women, who perform critical roles in planting, processing, and sorting, frequently face marginalization and lower pay. Children, when pressed by economic hardship, are sometimes drawn into field labor. Corporate audits, codes of conduct, and certifications attempt oversight, but they are imperfect, easily circumvented, and often under-resourced. The human cost remains largely hidden behind certifications, packaging, and branding that emphasize taste or origin stories rather than labor realities. Meanwhile, global markets reward scale, efficiency, and reliability. China, large multinational companies dominate trading. Their power allows them to blend beans from multiple origins, switch suppliers rapidly, and exploit economies of scale, all while insulating themselves from the risks of production. Smallholder farmers, producing the majority of the world's coffee, are price takers in a volatile global market. When market fluctuations occur, whether due to climate, disease, speculation, or geopolitical disruption, Farmers bear the losses. Speculative trading on coffee futures further decouples market prices from production realities, creating volatility that can devastate communities without impacting investors. Specialty coffee markets, while emphasizing quality, origin, and artisanal methods, introduce their own pressures and higher standards for flavor, bean size, and defect rates demand intensive labor, careful selection, and sometimes additional infrastructure. When beans fail to meet criteria, farmers lose potential income. Premiums are never guaranteed. Investment is risky. Consumers may enjoy tasting notes and elaborate origin stories, but the economic and labor pressures behind these experiences remain largely invisible. Environmental sustainability. Coffee cultivation in monoculture plantations, while efficient for mass production, threatens biodiversity, soil health, and water quality. Deforestation for new coffee farms contributes to carbon emissions, reduces ecological resilience, and exacerbates climate-related risks. Shade-grown, organic, or regenerative coffee practices exist as alternatives, but scaling them is challenging. Adoption requires technical knowledge, labor investment, and often higher upfront costs, barriers that smallholders face disproportionately. Technology and traceability initiatives offer both promise and paradox. Blockchain digital monitoring and data-driven platforms claim to enhance transparency, providing consumers and buyers with information about origin, labor conditions, and sustainability practices. Yet control over these tools is centralized, usually with buyers or intermediaries, reinforcing power asymmetries. Farmers who share detailed data gain access but risk exploitation. Data becomes a commodity in itself, extending existing inequalities rather than resolving them. The social dimension of coffee continues to evolve. Globally, coffee is both a daily ritual and a cultural marker. Specialty cafes and social media narratives celebrate origin, flavor, and craftsmanship. Consumers participate in symbolic practices, connecting identity and taste. Yet these experiences rarely reflect the structural realities of production. A latte or espresso connects digitally and emotionally to origin stories, but the farmer's precarious labor, climate vulnerability, and economic risk remain largely abstracted. Coffee consumption has become simultaneously personal, social, and disconnected from production. Global inequities are mirrored in consumption patterns. High-income countries dominate consumption, often oblivious to the cost borne in producing regions. Developing countries supply the majority of beans, yet retain minimal value-added benefits. Branding, roasting, packaging, and marketing capture the largest share of profit. Ethical sourcing and certification programs attempt to redistribute value, but their reach is limited, and compliance costs often exclude the most vulnerable producers. Structural inequities are maintained even as awareness grows. Looking forward, multiple crises intersect. Climate change threatens yields and quality, potentially displacing traditional growing regions and pushing prices higher. Labor shortages and migration challenge production continuity. Environmental degradation reduces resilience. Financialization and speculation increase market volatility. Consumer trends, while increasingly demanding transparency and quality, may inadvertently pressure farmers to meet higher standards without consistent reward. The system is highly interconnected, and each stressor amplifies the others. Analysts predict that without intervention, the 21st century coffee industry will face persistent shortages, rising prices, and social unrest in producing regions. Yet intervention is complicated by entrenched interests, market consolidation, and the globalized nature of trade. Solutions require coordination across scales: farmer support, market reform, labor protections, environmental stewardship, and consumer engagement. Piecemeal approaches risk maintaining existing inequities under a veneer of ethical or sustainable branding. Reforms often focus on several key strategies. First, establishing living income benchmarks and stable contracts could buffer farmers from market volatility. Second, localizing value-added processes. Processing, roasting, branding could capture more revenue within producing regions. Third, investment in climate adaptation infrastructure, research into resilient varieties, and diversified agroforestry systems could enhance long-term sustainability. Fourth, strengthening labor protections, ensuring fair wages, and supporting cooperative governance could address exploitation. Fifth, rethinking supply chain transparency to genuinely empower producers rather than centralizing control and buyer platforms could shift power dynamics. Each of these strategies requires political will, economic commitment, and collective action. Cultural awareness also plays a role. Consumers can influence the system through informed purchasing, advocacy, and support for ethical sourcing. Yet individual action is insufficient in isolation. Structural change is required to address the systemic imbalances embedded in centuries of trade, industrialization, and global market concentration. Coffee's narrative is as much about human decision-making as it is about beans, soil, or climate. Despite these challenges, coffee continues to inspire fascination and innovation. Specialty coffee competitions, barista culture, brewing science, and new processing methods highlight the human capacity for creativity. Yet these developments exist alongside persistent inequities, climate pressures, and labor challenges. Each cup is simultaneously a story of ingenuity and a microcosm of global tension. The broader lesson is clear. Coffee is not merely a commodity, a stimulant, or a ritual. It is a lens through which we can examine historical power, social structures, environmental sustainability, and economic inequality. Its history illustrates how trade, empire, industrialization, and finance interact with human labor and cultural practice. Its present exposes the limits of market mechanisms to ensure fairness, resilience, and justice. Its future will depend on the choices of producers, consumers, corporations, and governments alike. From Chaldees goats in the Ethiopian highlands to the bustling cafes of Tokyo, New York, and Paris, coffee has always reflected human priorities, fears, and creativity. It has alternated between inspiration and control, from spiritual aid to economic engine. It has been banned, coveted, manipulated, and celebrated. Across centuries, the bean has linked disparate societies, driven colonial expansion, fueled labor exploitation, and inspired artistic expression. It has shaped urban life, work culture, and global trade networks. Every sip of coffee today carries echoes of this history. The aroma, the flavor, the ritual of preparation, all are mediated by complex systems spanning continents, centuries, and cultures. To drink without awareness is to participate passively in these networks. To drink with understanding is to acknowledge the layered human and environmental realities embedded in a simple act. Coffee becomes a conduit not only for caffeine, but for reflection, responsibility, and connection. Ultimately, coffee's story is ongoing. Climate change, social justice, and market dynamics will continue to shape production, trade, and consumption. Technological innovation, policy reform, and ethical engagement may alter outcomes, but only if stakeholders act collectively and strategically. The beverage itself is resilient, adaptive, and culturally entrenched, but resilience in the bean does not guarantee resilience for the people who grow it. Taste, convenience, and habit are intertwined with histories of labor, colonialism, and inequality. Commodity chains are never neutral. They reflect the values, priorities, and power structures of the societies that consume and produce them. Coffee reminds us that everyday choices carry embedded histories and responsibilities. It has been a sacred stimulant, a social catalyst, a colonial resource, and an industrial product. It has inspired innovation, discourse, and artistry, while exposing structural inequities and environmental vulnerabilities. Understanding this trajectory allows us to see beyond the cup, to recognize the human stories, systemic forces, and ethical dilemmas behind a familiar ritual. Each cup, then, is both ordinary and extraordinary. It is ordinary in its ubiquity, extraordinary in the depth of history, labor, and ecology it represents. Drinking coffee is engaging with a centuries-long network of culture, commerce, and control. Awareness, curiosity, and responsibility can transform this engagement from passive consumption into informed participation. The story of coffee is a story of human ambition, struggle, and ingenuity, a story that continues to evolve with every harvest, every market decision, and every cup poured. And so coffee is more than a beverage. It is a lens on human civilization, a mirror of global systems, and a reminder that everyday choices, what we drink, how we source it, and how we value labor, matter. Its history and contemporary reality compel reflection on sustainability, equity, and the power structures that shape lives far from our own kitchens. The simple ritual of brewing a cup of coffee invites engagement with the complex web of environmental, social, and economic realities it embodies. Coffee's journey reminds us that even ordinary pleasures are intertwined with extraordinary systems, responsibilities, and histories. Coffee, a simple beverage that greets billions each day, carries within it a history as complex as empires and as intimate as a quiet morning ritual, tracing back to the rugged highlands of Ethiopia around the 9th century, where, according to legend, a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats behaving unusually, leaping with sudden energy after consuming the bright red berries of a native shrub, an observation that would, whether myth or reality, become the symbolic origin of one of the world's most influential commodities. Linking human curiosity to the natural world in a way that would reverberate across centuries, civilizations, and continents, a narrative that is at once enchanting and incomplete, for the true story of coffee's rise is woven not from legend alone, but from centuries of human ingenuity, trade, domination, labor, and adaptation, beginning with the use of coffee by Sufi mystics in Yemen, who harnessed its stimulant properties to sustain night-long prayers and rituals, a practice that transformed the plant from a local curiosity into a controlled, highly valuable commodity. Tightly regulated by traders and overseers who roasted beans before export to prevent cultivation elsewhere, establishing an early monopoly that linked Yemen's highlands to the ports of Mocha and onward to the bustling markets of Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, cities where coffee houses emerged as new social spaces, distinct from mosques, homes, or bazaars, offering venues for discussion, debate, and exchange of news, and simultaneously evoking suspicion from authorities who feared that alert minds gathering in communal spaces might challenge political and religious hierarchies, prompting attempts at bans, public burnings of coffee beans, and inconsistent enforcement. All of which ultimately failed because coffee houses had already become integral to the fabric of urban life, reflecting the tension between social control and individual agency, a dynamic repeated as coffee spread into the Ottoman Empire, where Istanbul's coffee houses thrived as centers of cultural life, drawing merchants, scholars, and officials into interactions that subtly challenged rigid social stratification, a pattern that would recur in Europe when coffee arrived through Venetian trade, sparking curiosity and fear, framed variously as a medicine, an exotic novelty, or a moral threat, a duality that was only partially resolved when the church sanctioned its consumption, transforming coffee from a foreign stimulant into a socially acceptable, almost sacred beverage in the eyes of European consumers, who rapidly adopted coffee houses modeled on their Middle Eastern counterparts, establishing new hubs for commerce, intellectual discourse, and social interaction in London, Paris, and Vienna, where they contributed to the emergence of public spheres that nurtured finance, politics, and culture. They're simultaneously promoting sobriety and alertness in contrast to the alcohol-fueled taverns, and embedding coffee into emerging capitalist norms of productivity, punctuality, and rationality. In rationality, Yet these spaces also reflected an underlying tension, as authorities periodically feared sedition or moral decay, highlighting the persistent interplay between individual agency, communal gathering, and state oversight that coffee seemed uniquely capable of amplifying. A pattern mirrored in the later colonial ambitions of European powers who sought to break monopolies in Yemen and elsewhere, smuggling live coffee plants to colonies in Java, the Caribbean, and beyond, where plantation systems depended on enslaved and coerced labor-scale production to satisfy growing demand in Europe and, later, North America, transforming coffee from a spiritual stimulant and social lubricant into a commodity inextricably linked to colonial extraction, human exploitation, and global economic inequality. A shift that detached the beverage from its origins, romanticized place names like Mocha, Java, and Jba. Bourbon becoming brands rather than geographic realities, obscuring the labor, culture, and ecology that sustained production, a trend that intensified during industrialization as coffee roasting, grinding, packaging, and marketing became mechanized and globalized, emphasizing consistency, shelf stability, and mass distribution while concentrating profits in the hands of traders, roasters, and retailers, leaving farmers as producers of raw material vulnerable to volatile markets, price swings, and financial speculation. With futures trading decoupling market prices from the realities of production, and with catastrophic consequences for communities when oversupply, disease, or weather fluctuations drove incomes into instability, a pattern exemplified by Brazil's cartel-like management of coffee in the 20th century, a time where surplus stockpiles were destroyed to stabilize prices, creating artificial scarcity even as rural laborers faced poverty and insecurity, a contradiction that is echoed throughout coffee history. Abundance for the market, scarcity for the producer, consumption normalized for the consumer, and labor invisible to those who enjoy the beverage. A tension further complicated by the rise of specialty coffee and ethical sourcing initiatives that attempt to redress inequities while introducing new complexities, compliance costs, and technological dependencies, such as blockchain traceability and digital monitoring, which centralize control with buyers and intermediaries while offering only limited empowerment to farmers who must navigate overlapping certifications, regulatory pressures, and market standards to maintain access to higher value markets. A situation exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, which increasingly threaten Arabica cultivation through rising temperatures, erratic rainfall, pest proliferation, and soil degradation, forcing farmers to adopt costly adaptive measures like irrigation, shade management, and new hybrid plantings, investments often inaccessible to the smallest and most vulnerable producers, whose economic precarity, labor burdens, and risk exposure intensify under environmental stress, further fueling rural depopulation, knowledge loss, and intergenerational vulnerability. All while global markets, investors, and multinational corporations continue to benefit from the stability and abundance that farmers struggle to provide, a reality mirrored in labor conditions where seasonal, migrant, and female workers perform essential tasks under conditions of limited protection, unsafe work, and low or exploitative pay, sometimes supplemented by child labor in communities under economic pressure, with corporate audits and ethical certifications often failing to detect, prevent, or rectify systemic abuses, thereby maintaining the invisibility of exploitation, even as marketing emphasizes sustainability, artisanal quality, or social responsibility, and where environmental degradation compounds social vulnerability, as monoculture plantations, deforestation, chemical use, and soil erosion reduce resilience, intensify climate impacts, and increase adaptation costs for those least able to bear them, creating a feedback loop in which environmental stress and social inequity reinforce each other. All while global demand continues to rise in product diversification, from instant coffee in pods to ready-to-drink beverages and functional blends, generates higher margins and convenience for consumers, while further distancing them from the labor, land, and ecological realities that sustain the supply chain, resulting in a paradox in which coffee is simultaneously intimate and remote. Personal ritual in the morning, yet a reflection of global inequities, environmental crises, and historical legacies of extraction and control. A paradox that is reinforced by cultural narratives in cafes, specialty bars, and social media, which celebrate flavor, origin stories, and craftsmanship, while often romanticized hardship and obscuring structural pressures, leaving consumers with sensory engagement divorced from accountability, while the global coffee system remains concentrated in the hands of a few corporations capable of blending, sourcing, and marketing across borders, reinforcing a power imbalance that leaves producers vulnerable to market fluctuations, climate shocks, and compliance burdens, and creating systemic precarity that persists across generations despite efforts at reform, such as cooperatives, direct trade initiatives, living income benchmarks, bench, MALF, and free, environmental certifications, and technological transparency, interventions that are often limited in scope, inconsistently applied, or co-opted by market forces, emphasizing branding and reputation over substantive redistribution of risk and profit, and highlighting the complex interplay of history, commerce, labor, and culture that defines coffee as a commodity, as a social lubricant, and as a global ecosystem in which ordinary consumption carries extraordinary consequences, illustrating that each cup is embedded in centuries of struggle, adaptation, and innovation. Encompassing the mythical moment of discovery in Ethiopia, the spiritual experimentation in Yemen, the social and political ferment of Ottoman and European coffee houses, the violent expansion of colonial plantations, the industrialization and commodification of production, the financialization and market concentration of the 20th and 21st centuries, the cultural reimagining through specialty cafes and artisanal narratives, and the ongoing environmental and social crises that threaten both production and equity. Ultimately revealing coffee as a lens through which we can examine global history, economic systems, labor dynamics, environmental stewardship, and cultural evolution. A beverage that is at once ordinary and extraordinary, commonplace yet deeply entangled with the forces of human ambition, exploitation, creativity, and resilience, and a reminder that even the simplest daily rituals connect us to broader systems of power, responsibility, and interdependence, emphasizing that sustainability, equity, and awareness are not optional, but essential if the story of coffee is to evolve into one that supports both those who grow it and those who consume it, and that in recognizing the layers of history, labor, and ecology in each cup, we are called not only to savor the beverage but to acknowledge the human and environmental costs, the ethical implications, and the global networks that make it possible, understanding that coffee is simultaneously a stimulant, a cultural artifact, a commodity, and a mirror reflecting centuries of human endeavor, and that by engaging consciously with this legacy, we can transform our daily ritual into an act of awareness and responsibility, bridging the gap between consumption and consequence, personal habit and global impact, flavor and fairness, and ultimately ensuring that the story of coffee is not only one of taste and tradition, but also of justice, sustainability, and shared humanity, concluding that every sip carries with it the choices, struggles, and histories of countless individuals, reminding us that coffee is never just coffee, but a reflection of the complex, interconnected, and evolving world in which we all live.